All right, guys, so if you missed class on Thursday, this will be the notes that you would have missed. Now, real quick, before you start writing anything in your notebook, I would not label this set of notes Introduction to Genetics. I kind of took this PowerPoint from Mr. Burris. I adapted it to fit our class, but he does this presentation earlier in the year than I do. For him, it actually is an introduction. For us, we've already been talking about genetics for a while. So I want your title in your notes to be about Gregor Mendel and his peas. You don't have to include the word revolutionary. Just Gregor Mendel and his peas will work just fine. As I usually do, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. Part of the goal in class today was to get some practice just taking notes, as you might be doing in high school. In high school, your teachers might be going a little bit faster than I do, not waiting so long to let you catch up. Something really important that you need to be trying to do is to summarize my notes. You shouldn't be writing full sentences in your notes the majority of the time. You should be writing a lot of bullet points, main ideas. Full sentences generally are not necessary in notes. I always put the notes of the whole presentation or a video like this, I always put it in the Google Classroom at some point. So you'll always have all the details. What you should have in your notes is just the overarching main ideas. So let's go ahead and get started here. So first off, we talked about what is genetics. Genetics was a vocab word for you. Genetics is just the scientific study of heredity. And then we also should define heredity, because that's another vocab word. Heredity is the passing of traits through generations. When we were working on vocab cards a few weeks ago, a lot of times I saw a couple of students looking up genetics and looking up heredity, and the definition was very similar. This, I think, will help clarify that. Upon thinking about it a little bit further, I decided that I think genetics would be the study. Like I said here, genetics is the study of heredity, heredity being the passing of traits. Okay, so genetics is studying the passing of traits. Heredity is just passing of traits, right? So the next thing we want to talk about is who is Gregor Mendel. By the way, feel free to pause this anytime you want. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker than I would in class. So who is Gregor Mendel? This is a pretty good summary of who he is. Now, before you start writing anything, this is a great time where you should maybe be using bullet points rather than full sentences. This is a full sentence about who Gregor Mendel is. What you could do instead is just write some bullet points. Read through this, leave out little words like a, who, in the. You don't need all that in your notes. If you do a bullet point, monk, bullet point, studied pea plants, bullet point, the mid-1800s. And then maybe the final bullet point would be a little bit longer. Maybe studied rather than learned about how. Okay, he studied passing of traits through generations. So sometimes you have to read through and summarize in however it works for you. If you want to write a full sentence, fine, but it's going to really help you in the long run if you can start trying to condense things for yourself. The other important thing to know about Gregor Mendel is that he is now considered the father of genetics. Good little trivia fact to know. All right, the stuff on this slide, you don't really need to write down in your notebook unless you want to. It's up to you. Just some kind of interesting facts about Mendel to sort of put him in context a little bit more. First off, he grew and tested over 28,000 pea plants in his 7 years of research. That's a lot of peas each year. I don't know, I was just amazed by that number, so I thought I'd throw it in here. This part is interesting. He didn't know anything about DNA, chromosomes, or meiosis. He didn't know about any of the stuff that goes on inside of cells because that's not something that we had really gotten to at that point in time. Again, this is the mid-1800s. So his entire study was just observing things that could be seen with the naked eye. What's kind of cool about this, if you think about it, you already know about DNA. You already know about chromosomes. You already learned about the process of meiosis. At this point in your life, you know more about the inside of a cell than Gregor Mendel did. He still did some pretty crazy cool stuff just using his naked eye, but it's cool to think that you know more about the cells now than he did in his entire life. All right. Last thing on here is just that his work wasn't appreciated in his lifetime. It happens a lot when people are doing sort of revolutionary and big things. A lot of times maybe their thinking is a little bit ahead of everybody else, so his work wasn't appreciated at the time. Decades later, though, it was rediscovered and recognized as really important, and we'll talk tomorrow about that sort of rediscovery and recognition that he got, but that wasn't until after he died. All right, so I do want you to write some notes on why peas. Now, this table over here, do not worry about trying to copy that into your notes. This is a great example of some nitty-gritty detail that you can always just go and look up anytime you want. But why peas? Let's take some quick bullet point notes on that. So Gregor tried doing a couple of different organisms. I know one was mice. He tried doing this study with mice, but they ended up being a little bit too complicated. There's something else that I can't remember what it was that he was maybe going to study before he decided on peas. But here are some of the main reasons he decided on peas. First off, they were easy to grow. They don't require a whole lot of water. You can pretty much put them in whatever type of sunlight you've got and they'll grow. They don't require super rich soil or anything like that. They're just really easy plants to grow. They grow really nicely. The second thing is that they have these easily identifiable traits. So looking at this first one, flower color, this is a big one that we'll talk about. If we're thinking humans, for instance, if he were to have tried to study humans and looked at their hair color, think of how many different shades of hair color there are among people, or eye color or skin color or whatever. We have all different sorts of shades of that, right? Peas are not that way. Their flowers are purple or they are white, and that is it. There are no green flowers, there are no blue flowers, there are no orange flowers. They're either purple or they're white, and that made it easy. All of these different traits had only two ways that they expressed. Seed color is another common one. The seeds would either be yellow or they would be green. All these various things, one or the other. All right. The next thing is that they can produce large numbers of offspring plants at once. So if you're thinking about a pea pod, think about how many peas are in a pod like this. Here it looks like there's maybe 4 or 5 peas in that one pod, right? So if you think about that, a human doesn't normally have 4 or 5 babies at one time. And then also, peas don't only produce one pod at a time. They'll maybe produce 5 pods at a time or more. So even if we just say 5 peas in a pod and 5 pods per plant, that's already 25 babies that one plant can have at one time. So that's large numbers of offspring plants that he can have at once. And he wants large numbers because he's doing some studies. He needs a lot of repetition. We know that in science we need a lot of duplicates, a lot of repetition in order to get good results. All right. Next is that they can grow to reproductive age pretty quickly. So what that means is that a pea plant only has to be like a couple weeks, maybe a couple months old before it produces pea pods. Okay. The other thing is that those peas in there, those are seeds. Peas are seeds. They can be planted pretty soon after the pea is ripe, and it will grow a new pea plant from it. So the turnaround in generations is really quick, much quicker than it would be with, humans. Humans can't have babies until they're like teenagers, and they have to be in their mom's belly for 9 months. So that's almost 2 decades that he would have to wait if he were doing the same thing with humans. All right, and the final one is that mating is easily controlled, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit here in the next slide. But again, with animals, you usually can't easily control things like mating. If you have a bunch of mice in a room, the boy mice are going to be making babies with the girl mice left and right, and if you keep them in separate containers, that's all well and good. But then if you put a boy and a girl together that you want to have a baby, maybe they will, maybe they won't, who knows. Plants are much easier to control that sort of thing with. Okay, now on this slide, before you start writing anything, the next number of slides here are going to say Mendel's experiments up top. So what I want you to do in your notes is to just make sort of a subheading that says Mendel's experiments. Anything that we talk about in the next few slides where it says Mendel's experiments up top can go under that subheading. Okay, now this particular slide, if you want to write some stuff down that you find interesting or whatever, feel free, but nothing on here is really stuff that's going to be tested too much, but I want you to be aware of it anyway. Okay, so quick little bit about flower anatomy. So these parts right here, these two sticky uppy things here and these two sticky uppy things here are the male parts of the flower. Okay, the anther, that little yellow bit up here, that anther is sort of like a testicle. It creates pollen, which in animals is sperm. By the way, we talked about this before, but if you just as a refresher, yes, plants do still produce male and female sex cells. Instead of calling it sperm, we call it pollen. For the female reproductive stuff, we still really just call them eggs, or it's still an ovary. Okay. So yes, these are the male parts here on the side. This is you could sort of think of this as like the plant's vagina. Okay, that's what receives the pollen. The pollen gets sort of deposited there, and it makes its way down this part here, down what's called a pollen tube, and it actually fertilizes the eggs right in here in the ovary. Those are what become the seeds. That's what become the baby plants. So that's where everything happens right there. Okay. Now, in nature, you might be aware bees are really common pollinators. Well, flowers have nectar in them. Bees like nectar. Bees want to get to the nectar. Well, that nectar is sort of down here. It's sort of difficult to get to. So bees have to like crawl all over the top of the flower in order to get down to the nectar at the bottom. Okay, so imagine you're a bee and you're flying around and you see some nectar down here. You're trying to get to it, so you're crawling all over here. Bees are kind of fuzzy. Okay, if you're a bee, you've got sort of a hairy belly. In crawling around all over this pollen stuff, and this pollen is like a fine powder, that's going to get all caught up in your little bee fuzzy fur stuff. Okay, you're going to have pollen all over your fur, you're going to get your nectar, and you're going to fly on to your next flower. When you land on that next flower, you're going to pick up some more pollen, but you're also going to drop off some of the pollen from the last flower onto the stigma, the female part of the second flower you've gone to. Some of that pollen is going to make its way down this tube and fertilize the seeds in here. So bees carry the pollen, or the male parts, from flower to flower and deposit it every time. That is how plant fertilization works. All right. Now, Mendel did a couple of things to control plant fertilization. First off, he might remove the male parts sometimes, which means he would just take a scissors and snip right there and snip right there to take those male parts off, right? He did that to be sure the pollen was going where he wanted it to go and nowhere else. Now, something else, you'll notice it says to be sure the flowers wouldn't pollinate themselves. Something that flowers can do is, if a bee has not pollinated them, they can actually either maybe when the wind blows, or maybe if just one bee lands on them, say a bee didn't bring any pollen from another flower, but that bee knocked some of its own pollen onto its stigma, then that could result in self-fertilization, self-pollinization. Okay, so essentially the flower would make a copy of itself because it's taking its own male sex cell and its own female sex cell and making a baby from that. So Gregor Mendel usually wanted to avoid that, so he would often remove the male parts of some flowers to be sure that wouldn't happen. He couldn't remove the male parts of all the flowers because he still needed that pollen for some, but that was just one way that he could control things. The other thing, you'll notice a paintbrush up here in this picture. Instead of having bees randomly go around and pollinate the plants, he would actually take a paintbrush and hand pollinate. So if he said, okay, I have this plant that has these traits and I want that plant to pollinate. Okay, sorry, let me back up. I have plant A, it has certain traits that I want, and I have plant B. I want to make plant A pollinate plant B. So he would take plant B and cut off the male parts so that plant B wouldn't accidentally pollinate itself. And he would take the pollen from plant A and move it over to plant B. Okay, so he would just use a paintbrush in place of a bee moving pollen. He would do it himself with a paintbrush. Anyways, those are just two ways that Mendel controlled the fertilization of his flowers, right? Moving on. first thing that Mendel wanted to do was to create a pure plant or a true breeding plant. Now what that means is that the plant repeatedly produces offspring with the same trait. Okay, so generation after generation after generation, this tall plant will only ever produce tall plants. This plant will never produce a short plant. That would be a true breeding plant. Okay, and I just basically said this. So a good way to summarize this in your notes would be a true breeding plant means tall plus tall always equals tall. Okay, that tall plus tall, those are your true breeding plants. They will always produce tall plants. Okay. Now he did this with all the different traits. Here we're talking about tall plants, but he did this with purple flowers. He made true breeding purple flowers, true breeding white flowers, true breeding yellow seeds, true breeding green seeds, all the different traits that we talked about before. He made true breeding plants for all those traits. Okay. So that was the first thing. Next, now that he has all these true breeding plants, now he says, okay, what's going to happen if we cross two plants that are true breeding for opposite traits? Okay, so if I have a true breeding white flower and a true breeding purple flower, what happens if I make them have a baby? Now, common knowledge at that time said if I do that, that baby isn't going to be totally white and it isn't going to be totally purple. It's going to be sort of a mixture between what the parents have. So think of it like paint. If you mix white paint with purple paint, you'll end up with sort of a lighter color purple paint, right? That was what was expected and sort of hypothesized at the time, that you would end up with mixed traits, right? Same thing if we're looking over here. We've got a wrinkled seed here and a smooth seed here. Common knowledge at the time said if I had these make a baby, the baby would be kind of wrinkly and kind of smooth, not totally either one. Finally, we got a tall plant and a short plant. Common knowledge would say a medium plant would result from that. Okay, so he did this. He did this with all the different traits, not just these three, but all the ones that he had identified. He did this, okay? Now, what ended up happening is not that mixing of traits that was expected. In fact, if we have a purple flower, have a baby with a white flower, all of the plants just are purple. They look like this parent, okay? So that wasn't what he expected. True breeding parents make hybrids, and all of those hybrids will display one of the traits of the parents, okay? He always found the same pattern. Again, don't write all this down. There's a easier thing to write down on the next slide. So even though one of the parents had white flowers, all of the offspring had purple flowers. Not a single one of the offspring had white flowers. Now he did this again with all the other traits, and in every case, this is what I want you to write down. In every case, one trait won over the other. In every case, one trait won over the other. So purple and white flowers isn't on this table here, but for instance, if we look over here, round and wrinkled. Again, common knowledge at the time would say the baby would come out somewhere between round and wrinkled, but in fact, the baby was just round. Just this one trait won over the other trait. So that round seed shape we'll actually end up calling dominant. So I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but this round seed shape is dominant. For seed color, yellow won out, so that yellow is the dominant seed color. Seed coat is kind of a weird one. Some of these other ones are weird. These are usually some of the ones we look at the most. All right, plant height also. Tall was a dominant plant type, short was not dominant. Okay, so, and I was referring to this, Mendel called the trait that won and the offspring dominant, and the trait that disappeared he called recessive. This is a good one to summarize as well. Try not to write in full sentences again. You could summarize this by saying trait that won, and then draw an arrow, dominant. Trait disappeared, arrow, recessive. So you can leave out the little words again, like the and he and the in. Another thing that can be helpful, we're going to be using the words dominant and recessive a lot. If you write the word dominant out the full way the first time, and then in parentheses, just make a little abbreviation for it. So maybe DOM would be a good abbreviation for dominant. First time you want to write out the full word so you don't forget what that word is, but you can make an abbreviation for it right away so that in the future, because we're going to be talking about these a lot, you can just use the summary for it. You don't have to use the full word, or the abbreviation for it, I should say. So the traits that won were called dominant. The traits that disappeared, he called recessive. Okay, so now we thought, all right, we have all these hybrid plants. A plant, we call them hybrids if they are the baby of two different types of true breeding plants. So true breeding purple, true breeding white makes hybrid purple plants. Okay, now what's going to happen if we cross two of the hybrid plants, both displaying the dominant trait? Well, we had a bunch of different predictions in class. What he found happened was that 75% of them showed that dominant trait still, but now 25% of them all of a sudden are white again. Now, this was kind of crazy. It kind of makes sense if you have a purple parent and a white parent. Okay, I get that all the babies would maybe just have the traits from the one parent. That kind of makes sense. But now we have two purple parents that had a white baby. What is going on there? By the way, you may notice this is technically incest. These are parents and these are the babies. And then he said, all right, I'm going to make these babies have more babies. Okay. Plants can do that sort of thing and it's fine. If humans were to do this, it would cause some problems, but plants can do it and it's not a big deal. But anyway, so what the heck is going on with this white flower? Well, we're going to look at some models tomorrow to see what exactly is going on there. But these were his findings. Okay. And this is something that I do want you to write down. And again, you can summarize this if you want to. In the second generation, 75% Dom, 25% recessive. Okay. We are going to be working with ratios, percentages, fractions for this portion of, or for this unit, I should say. As long as you're familiar with 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%, and 0%, you'll be fine. Just those five, if you got those five down, you'll be fine. All right. And again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. So you don't have to write anything down here. I just wanted to highlight real quick because most of the time when we see little cartoons or diagrams of Mendel's experiments, we only are seeing like 4 plants at a time. But I wanted to highlight that he did this with thousands of plants. Here he had 705 purple plants and 224 plants, and he reduced that to a ratio of 3:1. Total, this is 929 plants, I believe, but keep in mind, this is only the flower color trait. He also did this with the green versus yellow seed color, the wrinkled versus round seed color. So this is just shy of 1,000, but adding on all those other traits, he did this with thousands and thousands of plants. Okay. All right, so now you notice we are moving on to Mendel's conclusions. We aren't doing Mendel's experiments anymore. We're doing Mendel's conclusions. And he had 3 conclusions that I want you to write down. First conclusion is that inheritance of traits is determined by genes passed on from one generation to another. Now, in reading that sentence out loud, you may have just had that go in one ear and out the other. For one, take time, go slow, think about each word, and do your best. Now, there's a number of vocab words in here. Inheritance is a vocab word. Traits is a vocab word. Genes is a vocab word. Generation could be a vocab word. I don't think it is, but it could be and maybe should be. If you are not keeping up with your vocab, sentences like this are not going to make sense, and we are going to be seeing a lot of sentences like this. You need to be keeping up with your vocab this unit, or else you are just going to be totally lost. Please tell me if there's a word that you can't find a good definition for, and I will help you, but I really want to make sure that you're staying up on those vocab words, all right? You're going to be totally lost if you don't. So let's break this down a little bit. Inheritance of traits is determined by genes passed from one generation to another. So the color of the flower is determined by the genes that the mom and dad pass to the kid, basically. Now, you don't have to write anything down here. I just wanted to remind you that Mendel didn't know anything about DNA, didn't know anything about chromosomes, and he actually never used the word gene. Instead, he used the term factor. You don't really have to know that, but I just think it's kind of interesting. His entire paper, this entire study, he was studying genes the whole time, but he never used that word. He used the word factor. It wasn't until later on that we understood more about what was going on, and we determined that the word gene was going to be a better description of what was happening. Okay, so that was his first conclusion. We inherit traits based on the genes that are passed from our parents. Okay? His conclusion number 2 said that a trait is determined by the interaction of two alleles, one coming from each parent. Okay, so breaking that down also. Actually, let's get some more definitions first. So for one, the word allele is going to be a really common word we're going to be using in this unit. Make sure you know what an allele is. And basically, it's just a certain form of a particular gene. To look at this picture real quick, this is the flower-colored gene. Flower-colored gene, so we can either have a purple flower or we can have a white flower. Okay, and here's the allele for a white flower and the allele for a purple flower. So the two different versions of the flower-colored gene, right? So, and remember, you always get one from mom and one from dad. You have 2 sets of each chromosome in your body, right? So say this is dad's chromosome and this is mom's chromosome. Dad gave a purple flower allele. Mom gave a white flower allele. Okay? Your trait, your physical appearance, is determined by the way those 2 alleles interact. Okay? Now, because we said purple was dominant over white, if you have a purple and a white allele, your trait, you're going to show a purple color. Now, that's a lot of information I just threw at you. We're going to dig into this more and more in the coming weeks. If that kind of went over your head, that's okay. Just make sure you have this written down, okay? And it'll make more and more sense as we go along, all right? Make sure you know what an allele is. And then remember that a trait is just a physical expression of a thing, what you look like. Mendel's third conclusion then is that some alleles are dominant while others are recessive. Now, this is a really good description of how dominant and recessive alleles work. So, one other thing I want to say real quick is that I'm using the word express in these definitions. Express is sort of a difficult word to find a good definition for your vocab cards online, just because express can mean so many different things. But in our case, express means to be visible. Okay, so if we replace the word express with be visible in this, if the dominant allele is present, it will always be visible. Okay, so if the purple flower allele is present, it will always be visible. The recessive allele, so the white flower color allele, will be visible only when the dominant allele is not present. Okay, so sort of breaking it down in those terms, I think makes it make more sense. All right, I'm going to stop here. We're going to continue on with these notes tomorrow. Dig a little bit deeper into some things and try to make more things make sense. But if you have all this done in your notebook, you are caught up from Thursday. Please let me know if you have any questions and make sure you are keeping up with those vocab cards. It is an important task for you. All right, that's it.